The snow had come early that year, and it came hard. Maren hadn't expected it. She'd watched the sky all morning, that particular grey that sits low over the Rockies like a lid pressed down over a pot, and she'd told herself she had time. Time to haul the last of the birchwood from the tree line, time to patch the gap along the north wall of the trapping shed where the wind came through in a thin, mean whistle. Time. She didn't have time. By midday the flakes were falling sideways, thick and fast, and the trail that wound down from her ridge toward the valley road had already gone white and featureless, the way a face goes blank when something terrible is being held behind the eyes. Maren had been living on that ridge for 14 months. She'd come up in the autumn, after her mother passed, when the house in Cochrane felt too full of everything that was gone. She'd packed a truck, driven north, and found the old trapper's cabin that her uncle had left her in a will. Nobody had expected him to write. It was small, it leaked, the hand pump on the well froze solid every night below -15. She loved it in the way that people love things that ask a great deal of them. She'd learned to live with the silence, what she hadn't learned, what she was still learning even now, in her second winter, was how to read the signs she didn't know to look for. The horses came before she heard them. She felt them first, actually. The way you sometimes feel weather before it arrives. A low vibration in the floor of the shed, a wrongness in the air. She straightened from where she'd been crouching over a rusted spring trap and listened with her whole body. 3 sets of hooves, moving at a walk which was worse than a gallop. A gallop meant urgency, meant someone passing through. A walk meant purpose. She came out of the shed with her hands still black with grease, and she saw them coming along the upper trail from the east. 3 men on horseback, moving single file through the falling snow, their shapes dark and shapeless in their heavy coats. They weren't local. She knew every man within 20 kilometers of this ridge, and none of them rode like that. Easy and unhurried, like they were arriving somewhere they already owned. Maren walked to the cabin and went inside and took the .30-06 down from the rack above the door. She didn't go back out. She stood at the window with the rifle at her side and watched them come. The man in front was big across the shoulders, with a wide-brimmed hat that shed snow in a curtain as he rode. Behind him came a smaller man in a canvas duster, and behind that one, a third who was built like a door, square and flat and immovable. They pulled up in the yard, and the big one called out without dismounting. "Anyone home?" His voice was cheerful. That was the worst part. Maren didn't answer. She watched the small man in the canvas duster lean sideways in his saddle and say something to the big one, and the big one nodded once, slowly, like they'd settled something between them. "Lady," the big one called again, "we've been riding since first light, and we're cold. We're not asking for much, just somewhere to get out of the snow for an hour." She knew what the hour was worth. She opened the door a crack and put her face in the opening. "Road goes back down, the way you came. There's a lodge in Nordegg, 22 kilometers south." "We know Nordegg," the small one said. Something in his voice had changed. Not angry, patient, like a man who is used to waiting for something he knows he's going to get. "Then you know the way," Maren said. She started to close the door. The big one got down from his horse. He moved fast for a man his size, faster than she'd expected, and she'd been trying to expect everything. He crossed the yard in 4 strides and got his boot in the door before it caught the frame. And then it was a different thing entirely. She pushed back with everything, and he pushed back in she had, and he pushed back with the easy, measured force of someone who knows the outcome already, and the door swung open hard enough to knock her backwards into the room. She had the rifle up before she'd found her footing. "You want to think about what you're doing," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. The big one stopped. The small one came in behind him, and behind that one, the doorman. "We just want to warm up," the big man said. His cheerfulness was gone now. What was under it was quieter and worse. "We'll be on our way before dark. You'll be on your way right now." Lady?" The small one took a step sideways, and Maren swung the barrel toward him, and the big one took that moment to move, and then everything happened very fast. She got one shot off. It went into the ceiling. The rifle was wrenched from her hands before she could work the bolt for a second. And she went down hard on the plank floor with the big man's weight on her arm, and her cheek pressed into the cold wood, and she thought, with a kind of clear and furious certainty, "This is not how this ends." She got her teeth into his wrist. He let go long enough for her to roll clear and get to her knees, and she had the knife from her belt. Before she was fully upright, the fixed-blade Mora. She kept sharp enough to shave with, and she put a cut along the doorman's forearm when he reached for her, and the small one said something sharp to the others, and for a moment they all stopped. 4 seconds of stillness. Snow hitting the window, her breathing. Then the sound of another horse in the yard. All 3 men heard it. The big one turned toward the open door. The small one stepped back. The doorman was holding his arm against his side, watching her with different eyes now, not patient anymore, uncertain. The man who came through the door had to duck to clear the frame. He was tall enough that he did it without thinking, the way a man who has lived in low-ceilinged places does. Automatically, without breaking stride, he wore a canvas coat that had so many times it was more patches than original. And he was carrying a splitting maul in one hand the way other men carry umbrellas. His face was half hidden by a beard that had gone grey at the jaw, and his eyes were the colour of January ice on a still lake, pale and cold and absolutely clear. He looked at the 3 men, he looked at Maren, he looked at the rifle on the floor. He set the splitting maul against the wall very gently, like he was putting something fragile down. "You'll want to go," he said. He wasn't talking to Maren. His voice was low, not loud, the kind of low that fills a room anyway, the way cold fills a room. You don't hear it come in, you just realize at some point that it's everywhere. The big man opened his mouth. "Now," the tall man said. Something in the word closed the conversation. Maren couldn't have explained it later, not exactly. Only that it was the voice of someone who meant precisely what he said, and had never needed to say anything twice, and the 3 men in her cabin understood this the way animals understand it, in the body, before the brain catches up. They went, not quickly. The big one held the tall man's gaze on his way out, the way a dog will hold eye contact as it backs down. But they went. She heard the horses in the yard, and then she heard them going, and then the snow swallowed the sound of them. And there was nothing left but the wind and the fire she'd built before noon, which had burned down to coals. The tall man didn't watch them go. He was already looking at her. "You're bleeding," he said. She touched her cheekbone where the floor had caught it. Her fingers came away red. "I know. Kitchen? Behind you." He found the basin and the cloth without being shown, and he brought them to her with a businesslike quiet that told her he had done this before. Not this exactly, but the tending of things that had been broken. She let him press the wet cloth to her cheek, because her hands had started shaking, and she didn't want him to see it, and somehow not watching what her hands were doing made it easier to hold still. "You were alone up here?" he said. "That's not unusual." "No," he said. "It's not." He said it, without judgment, and without the particular kind of pity she'd been bracing for, the kind that comes wrapped in "you should have known better." He just said it like a fact, like a man who has also been alone and knows that it is neither a virtue nor a failure, just a condition. She looked at him properly for the first time. Up close, the grey in his beard was more extensive than she'd thought. There were scars on the backs of his hands. Old ones, white against the weathered skin. His knuckles were the kind of big that comes from work, not from fighting, though she suspected it was sometimes both. "Who are you?" she said. "Everett, Maren." She moved the cloth away from her face and looked at the smear of blood on it. "Where do you come from?" He gestured, vaguely north, the way people up here always gestured, with the understanding that north covered an enormous amount of ground, and most of it didn't have names. "How did you know to come here?" "I didn't," he said. "I was crossing the ridge. I saw the horses in your yard." He paused. 3 horses. 1 set of tracks going to the shed and back. She understood. He'd done the arithmetic before he'd come through the door. "You could have kept riding," she said. Everett looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the cloth and rinsed it in the basin and wrung it out with one twist of his hands. "I could have," he said. He handed the cloth back to her and went to put wood on the fire. His name was Everett Marsh, and he had a line cabin 4 kilometers north, above the second tree line, where the spruce thinned out and the rock took over. He'd had it for 6 years. Before that, he'd had a different life. He told her this in pieces, over the next several hours, while the storm outside built itself into something serious, and it became clear that he wasn't going anywhere before morning. He'd been a wildland firefighter once. Before that, a ranger. He'd come up to this country after something that he didn't describe. Directly, only circled, the way you circle a wound that isn't ready to be touched. He said, "There were reasons," he said. "It was time for something quieter," he said. "I don't miss what I left." And then he was quiet. For a moment, and she understood that the silence around the sentence was part of the sentence. She told him about Cochrane, about her mother, and the house that had felt too full of absence, and the uncle's will, and the first winter when she'd made every mistake a person could make while still surviving. The frozen pipes, the roof section that collapsed under ice load, the week she'd run low on propane and burned furniture to keep the temperature above dangerous. "You stayed," he said. It felt like staying was the right thing. She looked at the fire. "I don't know how to explain that better." "You don't have to," he said. She'd made tea at some point, and they sat with mugs going cold in their hands, while the storm threw itself at the north wall, and outside the snow had swallowed everything, the yard, the tree line, the trail down to the valley. The world had narrowed to this, the firelight, the 2 of them, the sound of the wind trying to find a way in and not finding one. She thought about the 3 men. She thought about the rifle on the floor, and her cheek against the boards and the small one's patient voice. "We know Nordegg," and the knowledge that had gone through her in those seconds on the ground, that being alone and being capable were not the same as being safe. She had always known this. Somewhere, she had chosen not to look at it directly. "They'll come back," she said. It wasn't a question. Everett had been staring at the fire, but he looked at her when she said it. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. Men like that, they go where it's easy." "You made it not easy." "I made it harder," she said. "Not impossible." He didn't argue with this, because it was true. He said, "I know the terrain between here and the valley road better than they do, better than most people do." She looked at him. "If they come back," he said, "I'll know before they reach the ridge." She looked at him for a long moment, this large, quiet man, sitting in her firelight with his mended coat and his scarred hands, who had come through her door with a splitting maul and 2 words, and turned 3 men around without raising his voice. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider this seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. Not performing thought, but actually doing it, turning the question over to look at its underside. "Because no one should have to do this alone," he said, "and because you weren't going to ask." The fire cracked, the storm shifted direction, and for a moment the howling outside changed pitch, fell briefly to a lower note that was almost like silence. "I wouldn't have," she admitted. "I know." He looked back at the fire. "That's not a fault. That's just how some people are built." He left the next morning when the storm broke, which was before full light. She woke to the sound of his horse in the yard and came to the window in time to see him moving north through the new snow, his shape growing smaller and then disappearing into the tree line without looking back. He'd left the splitting maul leaning against the inside of the door. She stood there for a moment in her socks on the cold floor, looking at it, and then she put the kettle on. He came back 4 days later. She was in the yard splitting wood. She'd found a rhythm with it over the winter, something almost meditative in the weight, and the swing, and the crack of the wood giving way. When she heard him coming down from the north trail, she kept splitting. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post without being invited, and picked up the second axe that was leaning against the woodpile and started splitting from the other end of the row. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. When the pile was done, he restacked it, and she went inside and made lunch, and he came in and sat at the table without being asked, and she set a bowl in front of him, and neither of them said anything about this being remarkable, because somehow it wasn't. "I went down to the valley road yesterday," he said between spoonfuls, "asked around in Nordegg." She waited. "Those men," he set his spoon down, "say, they've been through 3 settlements in the last 2 months, always the same, moving through, looking for places where people are alone, properties that are isolated." Her stomach went cold. "What are they after?" "Depends on what's there." He looked at her steadily. "Your place has value. The trapping rights on this ridge are worth something to the right buyer, and you're not registered with the land office as the current holder. Your uncle's name is still on it." She hadn't known that. She'd never thought to check. So they could come back and claim the property isn't mine. Legally, it would be complicated. He paused. "But the kind of men who move like that, they don't usually wait for legal." She sat with this. Outside, the first light of afternoon was coming sideways through the window, lying flat and gold across the kitchen floor. "What did you do about it?" she said, because she could tell he had done something. For the first time since she'd met him, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one had been there recently and might return. "I talked to a man I know at the land office in Rocky Mountain House," he said. "Your paperwork will be filed by end of week. Your name, current holder." She stared at him. "You had the deed," he said. "That was enough. I didn't ask you to do that." "No," he said. He picked up his spoon again. "You didn't." She thought about being angry. She moved through the argument in her head. The one about not needing help, about handling her own affairs, about the particular exhaustion of having people act on your behalf without consulting you. She knew that argument well. She'd had it with herself for 14 months. Then she thought about the 3 men in her cabin, and the rifle on the floor, and the sound of Everett's voice saying now, and the way the room had changed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, like it was settled, and finished his soup. The 3 men came back in the 3rd week of November. Maren was ready, not because Everett had told her to be ready. She would have been, anyway, but he had shown her the 2 places on the upper trail where the trees gave clear sightlines to the approach from the east. And he had set a simple trip wire with a bell across the lower path, the kind of thing that wouldn't stop anyone, but would tell you they were coming with enough time to think. She heard the bell at 3 in the afternoon. She was across the yard in less than a minute, up into the blind he'd cut in the spruce stand with a view of the trail. She watched the 3 figures coming up through the snow. The same 3, she was certain, though they'd changed their horses. The big one in front, the small one in the canvas duster. The doorman, his right arm held slightly different, now careful, where her knife had found him. She had the 30 Naso 6 and 2 boxes of shells and 4 hours of light left. She waited. They were 20 meters out when Everett came out of the trees on their left. He came out quietly, the way he did everything. Already there before they registered the fact of him. He was on foot. He had the splitting maul in one hand, and in the other, nothing. He didn't need anything else. He was simply present the way a mountain is present, indifferent to whether or not you acknowledge it. "You've come a long way," he said to the big one. The big man's horse shifted under him. The small one's hand moved toward his coat. "I wouldn't," Everett said, pleasantly, like commenting on the weather. The hand stopped. "The property is registered," Everett said. "Properly this time. It's done. Whatever story you were carrying up here with you, it won't hold." The big man looked past him, scanning the tree line, looking for how many, trying to calculate. "There's nothing to calculate," Everett said, like he'd read the thought. "You've been in 3 settlements, and you know how this ends when there's a witness." "I'm a witness." He let that sit for a moment. So is she. Maren stood up in the blind. She didn't raise the rifle, she just let herself be seen. The small one said something under his breath. The big man's jaw moved. "You're going to turn your horses around," Everett said, "and you're going to go back down the way you came, and this is going to be the last time any of us see each other. That's a good outcome. Everyone goes home." He paused. "The other outcomes are not good." The big man looked at him for a long time. Then he turned his horse. The others followed, and she watched them go, down through the new snow, back along the trail, smaller and smaller, until the tree line swallowed them, and she stood in the spruce, blind with the rifle at her side, and breathed the cold air in and out until the shaking in her hands stopped. Everett came through the trees toward her. She climbed down from the blind, and they stood in the snow a few feet apart, and she looked at him and he looked at her. "It's done," he said. "Is it? For now?" He looked in the direction the men had gone. "There are always more, but those ones won't be back." She nodded. She believed him. She didn't know exactly why she believed him. Only that he said things with the weight of someone who has paid for what he knows, and she had learned that that was a different kind of knowing. "I keep thinking," she said, "that I should be used to this, living up here. I thought being capable was enough." "It's not nothing," he said. "I know, but it's not everything." The light was going fast now, the way it does in the mountains in November, not fading gradually but dropping, the sky going from pale gold to deep blue in the space of 20 minutes, the temperature falling with it. "Come have supper," she said. It wasn't an invitation she had to think about. "It's too late for you to make it back to your place before dark." He looked at her for a moment with those pale, clear eyes. "All right," he said. She started back toward the cabin and he fell into step beside her. And the snow creaked under their boots, and above them the first stars were coming out over the ridge, cold and sharp and impossibly far away, and she thought, "This is something. This is not nothing at all."